What has actually happened in the January transfer window and which deals have gone under the radar? Well, let's talk about it with John Mackenzie, JJ Bull and David Ornstein, still on his phone. Welcome to the Deal Sheet. Yeah, David, let's start with that first question, right? I mean, look, it feels like it's been really quiet so far. From your perspective, why has that been?
Well, nothing will beat the January 2011 window, in my view, which saw Fernando Torres move from Liverpool to Chelsea, Andy Carroll helicopter down from Newcastle to Liverpool. I think Luis Suarez moved from Ajax to Liverpool in the same window. This hasn't been spectacular, but it's been pretty solid, I think. It started with managerial changes that were more prominent perhaps than the player deals, but there was a bit going on. Brennan Johnson moving from Spurs to Crystal Palace, their record signing. Then we saw Mark Gay switching from Crystal Palace to Manchester City. Wedged in between those was Antoine Semenyo from Bournemouth to Manchester City. So there have been deals here and there, and there will be more before the window shuts. But I just think across the board, clubs are getting their houses in order more than ever before and planning more heavily around the summer windows. Winter increasingly seems to be for emergencies, injury crises, maybe clubs who have that little taste for European qualification unexpectedly, or who are maybe facing a relegation battle that they didn't see coming. So yeah, it's been lively enough, but we've become so conditioned by the summers, which are just absolute madness honestly, these days, that nothing's going to compare. But it's not done yet, and so we could have some little fireworks before that deadline, 7 p.m. UK on Monday.
Oh, he's teasing us, all right.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting if we look at the big movers this January, because we like to talk about who won the transfer window in the summer. Whereas I think in January, the reality is you win the transfer window by not needing to spend money, right? If we look through the big movers in the window so far, they've all had issues that they've had to address. So we've got a bunch of teams here who haven't been doing very well this season. So Spurs obviously haven't had as good a season as they would have wanted. They've brought in Conor Gallagher to beef out their midfield. And then elsewhere, West Ham team in a relegation battle. They brought in a couple of strikers, and I think we're going to talk about the striker market a little bit more because clearly there's a little bit of a merry-go-round with strikers. Then Bournemouth started the season well but have dropped off. We'll talk about them a little bit more later. And then Palace as well, who've had their own problems, and it's looking as though they might have to deal with the loss of Jean-Philippe Mateta. So again, that's contributing to that striker market. But if we talk about the teams who are actually doing quite well this season, we've got Man City and Villa. Both of these teams are, as David said, looking to maybe boost themselves ahead of a title race, but they've also had issues to deal with in the sense that Villa have had an injury crisis in their midfield, so they brought in Douglas Luiz, for example, to cover that. And then City as well, bringing in Gay, as David said, and Semenyo, and bumping that right up as well. Now, City have offset their net spend by selling Oscar Bobb, which is something I think David has reported recently.
Yeah, Oscar Bobb was maybe the repercussion, the consequence of Manchester City bringing in Semenyo and bolstering in the wide areas and never quite finding his role at City, despite coming through from a young age and having flashes of brilliance. Afflicted by injuries, of course, and that meant that this January was always, as I understood it, going to be him being sold. And at the time of recording this, but by the time you watch it, it should all be done and dusted. He's undergoing a medical at Fulham. It's a £27 million deal. There is a 20% future sale clause that Manchester City tend to put in with many of their players, and matching rights. So if ever clubs are going to come in with offers, Manchester City essentially have first refusal on him. And I think it was so important for Fulham to bolster in the wide areas. Not only Adama Traore leaving for West Ham, but they've got Chukwueze, who is on loan from AC Milan. They could lose Harry Wilson from that right side as well, because he's going to be a free agent in the summer, and he's been so influential for them recently. And so Bobb's got a brilliant platform here to become a real star down at Fulham and show the sort of promise that he has displayed for Manchester City. And a Norway national team, and we're going to come on to speak about another of their players shortly, that is just brimming with talent.
And one of them being Jorgen Strand Larsen. He's one of your ones to watch this week. What's the latest?
Yeah, Leeds were the only club at that point to have made an offer to Wolves. It was rejected. We now learn that to be multiple offers that got up to around £40 million. they're reluctant to go higher because of their PSR situation. They've also got Dominic Calvert-Lewin doing well, and results have picked up too. Crystal Palace have always been in the mix as well. A strong interest that's kind of led by their sporting director, Matt Hobbs, who previously held the same role at Wolves, and he signed Strand Larsen, so there's a clear connection. But Crystal Palace, on the morning of recording this, we reported, and it's always important to caveat that by saying, as we talk, because things can change, and they often do, as we saw with Mark Gay when we last recorded this show. Crystal Palace are close to agreeing a fee for him, which the conversations are centred on around sort of £45 million plus £5 million in add-ons, which is below what Newcastle were offering in the summer. £55 million, I think they got up to multiple bids. They were essentially bidding against themselves, but Wolves held firm after his very impressive season in terms of goals and assists in his first campaign in the Premier League. It's not been as good this season, affected by an Achilles injury and also Wolves languishing at the bottom of the Premier League. Those conversations are between Crystal Palace and George Mendes on behalf of the so-called super agent on behalf of Wolves. We know he has a strong connection with them. And the idea that he would be leading these talks is to try and get the price as high as possible, and in an attempt to convince Wolves to sell, because I think their ownership is quite keen to keep their best players at the club. And so it is moving in that direction, but we'll have to wait and see how it unfolds. These things can change. Obviously, Crystal Palace, in order to let Jean-Philippe Mateta go, which he wants to do, they've got two criteria. They want to receive a package that is satisfactory to them, believed to be in and around £40 million, and a replacement with Strand Larsen emerging as the top candidate. But there are so many moving parts in these things. You have to wait and see how it unfolds, because it could easily go in a different direction. But yeah, the interest is concrete. The process, the talks are advancing, but nothing's done as we speak.
There's a bit of a striker merry-go-round happening at the moment, because certain strikers' movements depend on the other going elsewhere. Now, look at Strand Larsen, and then we look at Mateta, for instance. Neither of them have had the greatest season, yet there's a lot of interest in them still.
Yes, because they score lots of goals, or they certainly did, or have done in the past. And also, there's not that many big strikers who are really skillful and generate loads of chances. Like Mateta, for example, has generated loads and loads of expected goals and lots of goals. 2 seasons ago, look at his beautiful shot map. This is what you want from a striker. It's fantastic. Expected goals at the bottom here, 9.4, goals 14. Now, big overperformance, but very good players can do that. Is Mateta a superstar? Well, the season after is levelled out more to where you'd probably want. That's probably where you want to be. If you're Harry Kane, you're above that, but Mateta's not going to be there. You see, he started shooting from distance. Michael Olise's left, and now he started shooting from long range. I don't know if that's relevant. And then this season, right now, this is his shot map. Now, it looks slightly different to what we had a couple of seasons ago, but what you also get is expected goals are 9.6, which I believe is actually just only slightly more than 2 seasons ago when he scored 15 or 14 goals, but he's only scored 5. So why is he missing all his chances? What's happened to him?
I have a thought, but I think you have a better thought.
Well, I'm going to just suggest maybe. Here is Mateta, he's there, and that is Eberechi Eze. Now, I think when you have really good players around you, you probably get different chances, but the way that data is measured doesn't often account for things like Eze will make this run and he'll be able to then spot this pass for Mateta that maybe certain others can't. Like Jeremy Pino's a very good player, but maybe Eze does something that other players wouldn't, and then even Mateta can't miss that, when he's not playing very well. And what you have here is, again, Mateta and Eze, the two pioneers of the Crystal Palace team last season. Eze's going to make this run in behind. I think this is Norwich is playing against. They're very worried about Eze, and that means that when they're all trying to track what he's doing when he gets to this situation here, Mateta can pull away and wait for the pass, which is perfect for him to score. So perhaps that's teammate quality around him doing that. And then you have, for example, now, this is Pino now playing in the 10, this is Mateta, he's going to run and make himself useful. So he makes this run across to wait for the little disguised pass, but Pino isn't quite as good at Eze in the final ball. He pushes it far too close to the goalkeeper. This is a really high value. Well, actually, it's only like 0.2 or something on XG, but you think, when you're this close to goal, you should be able to score, but it's too close to the goalie. So he comes out, he smothers it, he blocks it, the ball bounces loose. The black line is probably where he wants to pass the angle, the yellow is where it ends up going. It's a tiny little mistake. So you can't really say it's because of the players around him, but also I think it probably is. Because when you consider that his expected goals are really high for this season, he should be on round about 9.6-ish, so about 9 goals at least, 10 goals maybe if he's having a good season. He's just missing loads of chances. There's a couple of things. He's got to play every single game because he's got no other teammates to replace him. Also, he's got a knee injury or some sort of leg injury, so he's playing through that as well. Probably needs a rest. But if you have good players around you, you're probably going to score more. And Crystal Palace have had so many games, it's starting to wind down, no one's replacing them, that's probably what's happened. Strand Larsen is a similar sort of player. He doesn't run in behind quite so much as Mateta does, but he's big and tall. Now, Strand Larsen last season had a non-penalty expected goals of 0.36 per game, which is absolutely quite good. This season, that has dropped off a cliff. He's 0.08. He's not getting chances at all. Wolves have dropped off. So last season, they were generating 1.16 per game. This season, 0.79. It's obviously a lot lower. So it could be that having sold all the good players around him...
Cunha's gone.
Yeah, Cunha's gone. Ait Nouri's gone.
Yeah.
I think three assists from Ait Nouri to Strand Larsen last season. So what do you get out of Strand Larsen? Why might else, if you're not going to be able to make goals out of him, what else can you use him for? Well, this is what Wolves do sometimes. This is them against Man United. Has the ball, as you can see here, launches it, and then Strand Larsen has to try and win that. So that's what he's doing here. Here's Wolves again against Man United. Goalkeeper has the ball, launches it. He has to try and win the header, knocks it down, and then they have to go from there. Here is Wolves on the ball. Lots of options. What do you think is going to happen?
Launches it!
And he has to try and win the header here. So Strand Larsen's using his body an awful lot. Who can be bothered doing this all the constant time?
A lot.
And they don't have players around him to support. So when he does get the ball, he launches it and he's able to take it down. A lovely little cushioned ball into his teammate, and they can go forward here. Maybe he's not going to outrun that back line. So this ball then just becomes a safe bit of play, and so nothing happens. So they can't build. They don't have the quality in the final third. They're not generating chances the same way they would. So Strand Larsen is not being used as much. And then I think what happens then is your confidence starts to drop, your momentum goes, and you just don't get the same chances you had, and you're not being able to take them in the same way because your confidence is lower. And so basically, Strand Larsen's being used as a link-up play, really important. He's very good at it, and he's still really functional within that team. But when you stop scoring the goals as well, and your confidence drops, and all you're doing is linking play, I think this is when you start coming out of the team, and he's been out of the team recently as well, so he's not being quite as useful. And I was just looking for fun to see how much he's actually having to deal with this. That's all he does.
I like that.
Well, it's what I do for my employment. Now, there's 8 strikers in this list. I'm not counting Kevin Shaddock, because he's more of a winger. And Strand Larsen is the 8th of it, and he's putting in a load of aerial duels. And I looked at it from the year 2016-17, which is the first year that Guardiola arrived. The strikers you had then were Benteke, Dini, Vokes, Negredo, Lukaku, Rondon, Laurent, Ashley Barnes. These are all big lads. These were all doing a lot of damage in the air. Benteke was putting in serious numbers of aerials per 90. There's the duels he was contesting. All of these players are contesting the ball in the air far more in the year 2016-17 than they are now. Strand Larsen's 5.1, but he's the 8th highest. So we may think of that strikers are constantly having to deal with these high balls and stuff like that, but they're not anywhere near as much as they were before Guardiola came in. So what you have now are players at Strand Larsen not having to head the ball on, but expected to be able to control it, link play and bring it in that way rather than win a header, knock it on and go from there. Also, they can drop in to offer you a way out of beating a press. And if everyone is pressing high and trying to man mark you everywhere, that's really, really useful tactically. And so players like Strand Larsen and Mateta can do that, but they are also very rare in that they can also generate XG and score goals. And so they're very much in demand. If you can get them, you want to bring them in regardless of where they are in their expected goals performance.
Well, let's go a little further back up the table. Tammy Abraham has now come back to Aston Villa, and another player that's coming back to Aston Villa, Douglas Luiz. What's the latest there?
Absolutely brutal. The 3 central midfielders who have been so integral to them, Kamara, McGinn and Tielemans, all going down for a considerable period at such a crucial stage of the season. Villa fighting not only in European competition, but more pressingly for the Premier League title. Let's be straight about that. And if they don't succeed there, then there's a Champions League place up for grabs. I think before the Tielemans injury, they were going to try and go with what they've got, because they've still got a very impressive array of central midfielders. But after that, no chance that they could continue. And so they turned back to a former friend. And Douglas Luiz is a player they hold in high regard, Unai Emery in particular. He sort of built him up to the stage he was at when he left for Juventus, which I think was largely down to Villa's PSR situation, financial fair play. To my knowledge, he never wanted to leave Villa Park, even though Juventus is obviously an attractive move. This season hasn't gone to plan on loan at Nottingham Forest. Hasn't sort of scaled the heights we know he's capable of. I think it was 13 odd appearances. So what's happened is the loan deal there has been broken essentially. And then Aston Villa have done a deal with Juventus, which is a loan until the end of the season with an option to buy at 25 million euros plus add-ons. And yeah, he underwent his medical, all fine, started training with Villa. it's complete, that one, and we could see him in action very soon. So a bit of a romantic comeback, and worth adding on that. Chelsea looked at him, I'm sure a number of clubs did, as a possible option, a good fit for their system for the rest of the season. It was one they declined to go forward with. They're focusing on Andre Santos and other existing options. But also important to say that Douglas Luiz only had eyes on Aston Villa. He really wanted to go back there, and people I speak to says he talks about them all the time and is so fond of his time there, and let's see if he can sort of recreate that and maybe go even better this time round.
Yeah, Villa fans excited about that one for sure. Yeah. Now let's talk about one of your specialist subjects that seem to have more players going out than coming in many respects, and that's Bournemouth, of course. But they've made some interesting signings so far, haven't they?
Yeah, you say they're my specialist subject. I do keep an eye on them, and this season everyone's been asking me what's gone wrong with Bournemouth, because started out the season quite well, but slowly have had that sort of decline. They had that long run without a win that was actually ended by Spurs. So yeah, really interesting just to look at Bournemouth, I think, from a tactical perspective this season, to ask what's gone wrong with them. So just starting out with a really basic XG for and against plot, just to give us a sense of, are they creating chances? Are they stopping chances from appearing? And what we can see this season is very much a sort of decline, both in terms of the attacking side of the game, but with that came an improvement at the defensive side of the game, which is kind of interesting, because from a few games into the season, we can see both of those trend lines just heading upwards, right? So getting easier to score against, but they're generating more chances themselves. So very, very interesting to ask the question, like what was it that happened to the defensive side of their game, which is, the thing that their team is built around that's made the numbers head in the wrong direction. And there's a few things going on here that I think are kind of interesting. So for someone like me who watches every Bournemouth game, it's very noticeable through the course of the season that their famous high press, the intensity of that press, had dropped off quite a lot. And this shows up in a number of different metrics. So I've got Mark Carey, one of our data guys, to run a few numbers. This is high regains over time. So high regains are when you press high up the pitch into the final third and you win the ball. And you can see in the course of Iraola's time, the trend line went up. Last season they were putting up incredible numbers, particularly at the beginning of the season. And then we've seen a decline down to this season, where actually they are winning the ball less in the final third than they have been. Now, I think that's clearly a team plan. They've clearly decided that playing at that level of intensity from the 24-25 season isn't enough. And so it almost seems as though they've dialed back the high press to an extent. But what's really interesting about this is if we dig into the intensity of that press, so we have a metric called PPDA, which stands for passes per defensive action. Now, the passes there are the opponent's passes. So when you're playing up against a team who have the ball and they're moving it around, how long is it before you make a defensive action? How long before you make a tackle or an interception or an aerial duel or something like that? And so generally speaking, you want to have a lower number of that. So you can see on the sideline here, 5 is right at the top and then 20 is at the bottom. So the higher up you are, then the more intense your press is, as a general rule. And as we can see, there's been a dialing up of that press through the course of the season for Bournemouth. When we get to this season, the trend line is heading in the complete wrong direction, and we have a metaphor falling off a cliff. I don't think there's ever been a
starker example of that, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's what's really interesting here, is that we're seeing Bournemouth essentially being unable to retain the kind of intensity that their press requires in order for it to be successful. And this raises a number of tactical questions, because if you are relying, and a big part of for your creativity to be through winning high regains, and you don't do that as well, and if you are relying on your defensive solidity to be on stopping the opponent from progressing the ball, and suddenly those things drop off, it impacts the way that you're then going to play. And I think part of the reason why this intensity has dropped off is because Bournemouth are now falling into mid and lower blocks much more frequently. So a nice piece of data here from the Opta analyst. The side we need to look at here is Liverpool, because what we're looking at is the amount of time that Liverpool spent playing up against a high block, a mid block or a low block against Bournemouth in their recent fixture. Now, normally you would expect Bournemouth to be, playing in a high block a lot of the time, but only 13% of that game spent in a high block, with the majority coming up against a mid block. And it's worth noting that I think if you are a team who you fill your squad with players who are good at playing in a high block or a high press, it's a very different skill set to what you want for players who are playing in a mid-block. High press is about getting close to your opponents, about getting proximity, having intensity, being able to read the press and arrive in those moments. Whereas in a mid-block, it's much more zonal, right? You're thinking a lot more about where's the danger going to come, how does everyone move as a collective, and so as a result, I think for a team like Bournemouth to move from one to another means that not only are they reducing some of the ways that they might generate chances or stop the opponent from generating chances, they're also not necessarily playing in a way that is going to suit their team and the players within it. So I guess the big question for Bournemouth is, why is it that they've had to make these changes? Is it because Iraola thinks that it's a better tactical way of playing, or is it because their squad hasn't been able to play in the way that he ideally wants them to? And I think when we look at the injury list for Bournemouth, it's pretty clear why they might have struggled to retain the sort of intensity and the high press that they play. Because I've just listed all the players who've had significant injuries this season, and you can see there's a bunch of players who are starters. Not only that, but it's happening throughout the season. So this is by game week, and we can see at the beginning you've got players like Lewis Cook, Ryan Christie, Justin Kluivert. They were all very important players last season. They start out injured at the beginning of the season, and we don't see. Ryan Christie still hasn't really made a return. He's not started a game for Bournemouth in the league this season. Lewis Cook has done so here and there, only just working his way back in. Justin Kluivert came back and then has got injured again. And these are really important players for them. Tyler Adams, he was a stalwart for them at the beginning of the season, and then he's got a long-term injury as well. So we can see that the level of the players that that we're talking about here, starting level players for them who simply haven't been available. And I think if we look on the board here, this is the Bournemouth squad, and we look at the areas where a lot of these injuries are coming from. This is the central midfield area. We can see the majority of their injuries are coming in these sorts of spaces. So Cook Adams playing in the deeper role. Christie was so important for them last season in playing in the 8 slot, and Kluivert in the 10 slot. These two have basically spent long periods of the season out. And I think Iraola has found some nice solutions. Dropping Krupi in from maybe playing as a striker early on in the season to play as the 10 has been good. Tavernier has obviously been filling in, but I think he's a player who actually fits better in the wide areas. And so I think it's pretty clear that if we look at what's going on with Bournemouth, a lot of this comes down to the fact that they just haven't had the players to play the way that they want to. And then if we think about the players that they brought in, it makes a good deal of sense, I think, that they've brought in players this January to try and address some of those issues.
Do you think the injuries are linked to the way they're being asked to play in the midfield? Because they're always really high for regains in the middle of the pitch, right, these guys? I
think so. I think when you play for a manager like Iraola, because of the intensity across periods, like you are going to be on a very strict cycle in terms of the physicality of the squad. You have to constantly refresh that squad, because we saw it with Marcelo Bielsa when he was at Leeds, came into the Premier League when they were promoted back in 2021, and they took the league by storm in that season. And then in the following seasons, they didn't refresh the squad well enough, and that was what then led to them falling off a cliff a little bit. So I think it's interesting that Bournemouth have just very quickly been like, okay, there's areas we need to address here. So let's just do this now rather than wait until the summer and see if we can pull something out this season. But midfield area, they brought in this kid, Alex Toth, 20-year-old from Ferencvaros. He just fits the profile of a Iraola player. He's going to be great off the ball. He can also play in any of these positions. So, and I think a big part of the issues that Bournemouth have been that Tavernier's been filling in the middle, and that's meant that, with injured players in the wide areas, Tavernier hasn't been able to play in his best position, and it's led to all kinds of problems. So bringing in someone like Toth, I think, is a good way of fixing a lot of problems at once in the midfield area. They've also brought in a goalkeeper in Christos Mandas from Lazio, a 24-year-old goalkeeper. Interestingly enough, if you look at the post-shot expected goal numbers, so that's essentially the underlying numbers that allow us to see how well a goalkeeper is performing against the shots that they're facing. Petrovic, bottom of the table for Bournemouth in the league. And so I think that's an area where you can look at it and say, with a replacement level player, even hitting the average, you may be expecting to win a few more points out of that. But the really interesting one for Bournemouth this season is a player called Rayan, is a
Brazilian.
Yeah, a 19-year-old from Vasco da Gama, who you've been reporting on, David, I believe.
Yeah, that's right. He is said by not just people around Bournemouth who might be slightly biased in this, but others I speak to in the industry who have no connection but know the Brazilian market well, to be a star in the making and the next sort of cab off the rank in terms of these really impressive, young, creative, skillful wide players or attackers in general. And the deal, I think, came in at just shy of £30 million, give or take, some add-ons here or there. A big release clause in there, reportedly, a long contract. And I know we spoke before about how Bournemouth might not look to replace Semenyo like for like. They might look to spread the resource across the team. They've kind of done both. As you outlined, they've recruited in different areas, but they have now brought in a winger. I don't think they're afraid in saying he is identified as the replacement for Semenyo. And that sort of confidence, when clubs you're talking to normally downplay expectations, they're very proud of that piece of recruitment, and I'm really intrigued to see how it goes for him.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say he's a potential Semenyo replacement. He could play anywhere along the front three. 6'2", so you know he's able to play as a striker if needed.
When I checked out whether Bournemouth might be in for Ethan Nwaneri because his game time was so limited at Arsenal, the word came back that they've lost some physicality with Semenyo and others through injury, and they've got quite a few smaller and nimble players. And by bringing a Nwaneri in, not that it was a possibility, it was just answering my question, it wouldn't fit the right profile. When they signed Rayan, I didn't actually look into his metrics and his size, his height. And so I presumed he was a small, nimble, tricky winger, and that's exactly what they told me they weren't going for in Nwaneri, but clearly I didn't research it well enough.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because he has played a lot through the middle for Vasco in the last few seasons. But he's very Evan Nielsen coded in the way that he plays as a forward, so he will drop in and he will help with link-up play. He also quite likes to drift out into wide areas as well, so that's why he's going to be used as a winger as well where needed. But I think it just gives them, like you say, a bit of physicality, but also a bit of flexibility in the wide areas, because Ben Doak, who was brought in the summer, has been injured for a little while, never really broke into the team in a real way. Tavernier has been playing a lot in the centre, as we've said, which has sort of left them with David Brooks and Amin Adli as the only options here as well. And I think Brooks and Tavernier can play on either side. Rayan can play on either side. It gives them a bit more in the wide areas. But also, if Evan Nielsen or Unal get injured again, and Unal's had long injuries, he arrived at Bournemouth injured, has just come back from a long injury. So there's the possibility that they might not be able to play an Evan Nielsen type player. If he gets injured or suspended, Rayan can fill in there as well. So it just seems like a really smart piece of business. One more thing I will say, signing Brazilians direct from the Brazilian league is not something that the Premier League has done a huge amount of. Generally speaking, there's a development pathway that often comes through Portugal because of the language, the similarities. Similarities, it's the same language.
It is the same
with very different accents, I would say.
That's regionally.
And obviously cultural similarities as well, which make that stepping stone easier. Interestingly, we've seen quite a few of these kind of signings happening in La Liga, right? So Neymar going to Barcelona, but then a bunch of players going through Real Madrid directly. So Endrick and Vinny Jr., players like that. Very interesting now that what we're seeing is a lower Premier League side being able to muscle into that kind of market and bring these kinds of players. And I believe that Rayan is the sort of player who a club like Real Madrid, like Barcelona, would be interested in. So very interested to see that the Premier League's pulling power is now so great that they can bring in a profile like this in the same kind of situation ahead of those big clubs. So maybe another indicator of the Premier League's growth in recent years.
Yeah, the Premier League's pulling power strikes again. Make sure you join us live for deadline day, because lots could still be changing.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including David Ornstein, Amy Lawrence and James Horncastle. With the latest transfer news and insights on every Premier League story that matters, theathletic.com puts you inside football.